We were doing Wanted Dead or Alive. I had been called in at the end to do the rewrite with Gary, and we became friends. We had to rewrite that script in 10 days. 10 days. So it was a real way to get to know the person. And Gary was sitting with me every moment of the time, and he told me that he was only giving me director's notes. But in point of fact, Gary was co-writing that script. He was there every single moment. So when the time came, and I was finished with my task, I said, Gary, I'm giving you screen credit on this. He said, no, it'll affect your royalties and everything else. I said, I don't care. It's the right thing to do. You've been the director's notes. I said, no, you wrote this with me. So he said, well, that's very kind, thank you. And we remained in contact. And then I got Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And I was over at Lakeside Golf Club, and I got a call, and it was Gary, and he said, how would you like to do Poltergeist III? Gary came to me with one line. He knew how to get to me. And I said, well, what is your approach to Poltergeist III? And he said, Alice through the looking glass. And I said, I'm on. It was a wonderful idea, a wonderful notion. And we wrote according to that notion and had great fun writing it.
Do your stuff.
He'd come up with something, and I would say, he said, how do you see the psychiatrist? And I said, Dirk Bogarde. And he said, you're going to write this for Dirk Bogarde? And I said, yes. I said, 20 years earlier, I'd written it for Louis Hayward. I mean, it's perfect. He said, he'll never do it. I said, I don't care. I'm going to write it for him. And then Gary made the decision. Well, I don't even think Dirk Bogarde was approached, but I wrote it with that sort of aphoristic, haughty Louis Hayward / Dirk Bogarde attitude. And then Gary cast it right on the spot from an actor. Richard Fire, I think was his name, that he found in Chicago.
Christ.
We both felt very good about it when Gary went back to Chicago to shoot. And then kind of got out of my hand because of some pressures that were put on Gary while in Chicago, budget cuts, that kind of thing. Everybody got along fine. I would hear things from Gary. A note came from MGM. It had to do with something with Carol Ann, of course, something that was totally inappropriate for the character. So I just, said, just yell out Carol Ann again. That filled the space.
Carol Ann!
Gotcha, you all right?
Carol Ann!
Where is she?
Carol Ann's drowning! She's drowning!
Where?
Carol Ann!
Down.
There were big budget concerns, and when Gary told me that he was going to do all physical effects, for me and Gary, I would have thought Gary might want to do physical effects anyway. There was no mention of the fact that the physical effects would cost less than the special effects. But there were budget concerns which required Gary to make changes on the spot, which is always tough. Gary made changes without me, and I'm sure that the changes that he made were right for the moment and sort of satisfaction for Alan Ladd. The one thing that I remember about Alan Ladd Jr. is that he loathed anything that put a child in jeopardy. So Gary just worked around all that as best he could. And as I say, he was a friend of Alan Ladd Sr. and Jr., so he kind of knew exactly what Alan Ladd Jr. required, but took the task on anyway because it's a major credit for Gary. I would have thought for another location for the mirrors, so that you never know when a mirror is going to pop up. For instance, if it were in a farmhouse, I'm not saying that this is it, but if it were in a farmhouse and the circus was in town with the funny mirrors, or shopping in the small town. And you have that contained feeling as well. And then you never know when a mirror is going to pop up. In a hotel, mirror's going to pop up all the time. But if you're in a location where there aren't any mirrors, and then all of a sudden a pool of water becomes a mirror, then you have that added shock. I would have, if we were to go back in time, I would go to MGM and say, consider this as opposed, because small towns, farms, again, something identifiable for the audience. I think that is something that we ought to really think about.
Kane!
Well, the old man had died, of course, and he was subbed by whoever that actor was. They did the very best they could with that.
You don't need Carol Ann. I can lead you into the light. I have the knowledge and the power.
Zelda Rubenstein became a friend of mine. We were both interviewed about that Poltergeist curse, as you know. She doesn't believe in anything like that. I think that Zelda was agnostic, atheist or something, but just the mere thought of anything otherworldly or celestial was anathema to her. So she really poo-pooed that.
Where did Dr. Rasputin take Scott?
She could be a tough gal when she wanted to be. I had an evening with her. I went out to dinner with her in the midst of all this. We were back in town and were having dinner, and of course everybody knew who she was because of the ads around Los Angeles about mother. She was the mother on the billboards to the HIV victims. Let mother guide you, whatever that was. So she was known all over Los Angeles, and also because of the Poltergeist films. And we were sitting and having dinner and sitting by the window, and some people stopped to take a look at her, and she screamed out, "What are you looking at?" And I said, "Zelda, you're recognized." Those were the looks of people wishing you well. Those weren't people with sour envy. And she kind of backed off a little bit, but the being a little person often got to her. But she was a sweet soul and extraordinarily bright. She'd be a joy to sit with. Her perspective of life was not mine, but I hadn't walked in her moccasins, so I just kind of sat like Plato at Socrates' knee and listened to her.
You are the only angel who can lead us into the light. We would never hurt you.
I was in Los Angeles and I got the call about what had happened, and I just knew that Gary would handle it. He was very close to the family, and I got a call with the details. Evidently the impacted bowel came as a result of well water. They were living in Arrowhead. This is what I remember. Zelda was very close to the family too, and they couldn't get her to the hospital in time. And then I didn't know. I had heard she had Crohn's disease too. And then when the impacted bowel happened on top of that, then it was just too much for the sweet little thing to get through. If you notice in the film, she doesn't look, she looks like she's forced to look 8 or 9. The face became very full, and she looked odd. She looked odd, and I gather that was the Crohn's and all that was going on. But when I heard, I was just so disturbed, especially when I got the details, and then I just knew that Gary would handle it as best he could.
What do you want?
When I saw Rough Cut, I had some problems with the cars smashing into each other. The sound was muted. It would be like an arrow hitting a body and not going thud. it was sort of, well, not off-putting so much as muted. I thought it was such a grand sequence that it needed more sound and a livelier kind of attack on that scene. I certainly, were I on the other side, no pun intended for Poltergeist, I would have thought that before we shoot in the tower, let's think this thing through. What makes a movie like Poltergeist work? Well, the familial aspect, family, that which is relatable, suburbs, and that whole wonderful thing about being on Indian grounds. Nobody would have known that. All that was very rich, and I think that without that resonance from the audience, and you start getting a little high flown in your desires, I think that you may have jeopardized, which is a family picture, because these were relatives of relatives. You lose all that, and your focus is just on the child when you've got to feel, I mean, they didn't even particularly care about her, as you remember in the picture.
Getting upstairs sounds great.
What do you got in mind?
Packing up everything that belongs to that little brat and sending her home to my sister.
She was not an asset, she was a debit to the family and a pain in the neck. I think that when I was writing it, and I take the blame for this, I didn't consider these things as much as I should have.
No, save your family. They're the ones who mean something to you, not me. That's not true.
If I had really done my job, I would have thought it through and say, wait a minute, folks. But there were timelines and all that stuff, and MGM had what MGM wanted, which was this location. And I gather, you could check with Gary on that, this location was just nifty. Well, it may be a nifty location, but it may not be nifty for your particular production. Alan Ladd came down for the premiere. I remember going in and seeing it and feeling, all right, it's all right. It lacked an urgency that I had felt in the other pictures, and God knows Gary's a wonderful, wonderful director, and I think because of that dark quality that Gary has, it was what the picture needed. If you don't know, he had written something called Raw Meat. Did you know about Raw Meat? Yes. And with very little, he did so much. He was the correct director for it. I personally feel that the problems that existed in the picture had to do with budget. The effects worked fine, performances were fine, except the constant calling out of that child's name.
Carol Ann! Carol Ann!
Carol Ann! Carol Ann!
It's just that there wasn't that Alice Through the Looking Glass that Gary and I had based this on. I felt that that had been compromised to a degree.
We're back!
People who are watching this either have an interest in movies as a viewer, or you have a fascination for ghosts, or you want to be a writer. And if you want to be a writer, write. The first thing that I said in this interview about people in the industry, because you do hear horror stories, remember the story that I told about Gary Sherman, who was so anxious to pay me back for the kindness that I showed him, that instead of being competitive, he embraced me for his new picture, which was Poltergeist III. Remember that when you go out there, that there are good folks out there.